Welcome to the Little Book Company podcast. This is our 38th episode. My name is Maniza Naqvi, and my guest for this conversation is Professor Dr. Manan Ahmed Asif. Dr. Manan Ahmed is an associate professor of history at Columbia University. He's a historian of South Asia. His works include A Book of Conquest, Shahnama and Muslim Origins in South Asia, The Loss of Hindustan, The Invention of India, and Disrupted City, Walking the Pathways of Memory and History in Lahore. And it's this book that we're going to be talking to Dr. Manan Ahmed about. Welcome, Manan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I am so delighted to have you here, despite all our issues with my issues with Zoom. And I'd like to start right away by focusing in on what you say yourself towards the end of your book are your intentions for why you wrote the book. Because it's a self-city-citizen triad story of Lahore on the vortex between memory and history.
Yeah, I think one way to answer this question about why I wrote the book is that it's part of it grew out of my dissertation project, which is looking at how a nation state like Pakistan imagines its history, long history, so going back to the 8th century. And what role does history writing and storytelling have to play with it? And one of the things that I was very interested in starting in 2006 and 7 was as Lahore was going through a series of suicide blasts, was how the city was rapidly changing and what the national idea of Pakistan and the very local idea of Lahore, how were they in conflict with each other? And to say very succinctly, I guess, in the sense that Lahore, in my imagination of a child growing up there, was that it was a city where you didn't see military dressed people, or you didn't imagine yourself under barricades. You didn't think that women had to be only seen inside the household, and so on. And that rapid change in the city within 2 years, as a result of the global war on terror and other things, really forced me as a historian to say, okay, how do I connect the self, the city, and the citizen in some kind of a coherent narrative that makes sense, especially for someone like me who works on medieval and early modern history, so who's not a historian of Pakistan but is actually quite used to working in 13th or 14th century, so long before the idea of the nation state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in Lahore, the way I see it in your book is that history pre-1947 that goes 1,000 years back and more was to a large degree expunged in the project of trying to build a new nation of Pakistan and the citizen Pakistani.
That's mostly right. I guess the book is titled Disrupted City, so I guess I can start to think through that word disruption.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, if we think about the long history of any city that's long enough, like London or Vienna or Paris, etc., we can kind of chart some idea of progress or some idea of growth. With cities, it's easy because cities grow in size. So one can always say, New York today is 15 million. New York at one point was 300 total, and so on. Lahore and some other cities in the subcontinent that have been partitioned have also gone through other forms of destructions, fires, floods, famines, conquest. migrations, forced migrations, and all of these things, in my understanding, disrupt that idea of a linear progression of the city.
Mhm.
And there was a historian who was writing about Lahore in the last decades of the 19th century, who, when he writes about Lahore, he is in Lahore, he's writing about Lahore, and he says, Lahore has gone through 13 disruptions, 13 times that has been invaded or flooded or been in fire, etc. And it has grown again and again
Mhm.
at the same place that it was, and it was always been named Lahore. So it's a unique city in that sense.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to extend that argument from the late 19th century
Mhm.
to what I understood, that there is another, some major disruptions are going to come, one of them being the partition and its violence, but then the articulation of the nation state as a purely Islamic or solely Muslim city,
Mhm.
um, which again is not the experience of anyone who lived in Lahore in 1946 or in 1890 would have been. In a sense, there's a project of citizen making that happens, but I wanted in my book to put that project not as simply an as an exclusive project to the state of Pakistan, but to say that this is a unique city in the sense that it has been disrupted again and again, but, and this is the most important part for me, it has come back to its form. It has become Lahore again. And maybe that's the hope, that Lahore will become Lahore again.
And is that the case with any city such as Lahore, which has layers and layers and layers of history of 1,000 years, and people come and go, that it holds its I can't say it holds its center, but it
Mm.
somehow holds its core.
Hmm. I mean, if we think about a city holds itself, its meaning in itself through largely two means. One is the material
Mhm.
world that the city is built of, the buildings, the gardens, the malls, the houses, the neighborhoods, the river, so on and so forth. And the other is the self that emerges in the writing of the people of the city.
Mm.
So how they narrate themselves as members of this polis,
Mhm.
their social contract. Who do they think they are when they are in the city and off the city and for the city? And I cite this beautiful poet from Saad Salman from 10th century Lahore,
Mhm.
who writes about his library in Lahore. He's at the time of his writing, he's imprisoned in Potahar, away from Lahore. And he says, my Lahore is this Lahore where I have a two-story library and I have beautiful, shops to go to visit and lovely clients that I hang out with. And, um, you know, a Lahore that is full of energy for him and love, both civic love and personal love. And so we can look at these two things simultaneously. He has a physical library that he talks about in his poetry, a two-story building, no less.
Mhm.
He writes about the Lahore he visits and lives in and remembers. And then, that's 10th century. So now, 1,000 years later, we can imagine accumulation of both those things. We can imagine accumulations of the material world, and we can imagine accumulations of textual histories and poetry and epics and so on and so forth. What I think happens after partition is that both of those things are uh, also partitioned. So Lahore is partitioned not only from Punjab, of which it is a central commercial and educational hub. But Lahore is also partitioned from its past, and this is because this Saad Salman that I mentioned is writing in Persian,
mm,
And Lahore is producing has produced texts that are written in Sanskrit and written in Punjabi and written in Braj and written in obviously Persian. And those languages are no longer part of Lahore's fabric after partition in the same way. So a citizen of Lahore cannot pick up a text from 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 1,000 years ago and imagine themselves as being in conversation with another Lahori from 6, 7, or 800 years ago because they can't read them. They physically can't access those texts. And then when we look at the built environment, the material world undergoes a radical shift. Everything from the removal of names on buildings, if the names were Sikh or Hindu, to uh, renaming streets and boulevards and removal of statues, some colonial, some non-colonial. Um, so the physical environment of the Lahore begins to shift radically. And then starting in the early 80s, you have the kind of growth of housing societies on the kind of edges of Lahore, which since then in the last 40 years have kind of doubled or tripled in size from the city as it stood in 1980.
mhm,
So these types of things actually make it impossible, actually, to what you're saying, to for a city to keep its sense of itself, because Lahore no longer has the capacity to read those texts or look around and see something familiar that's still in use or still has a resonance.
mm.
And hence the book tries to kind of deal with history and memory as these dual engines of both erasure but also remembrance.
I- and this new Lahore that's or the sub yeah it that's Lahore now, different Lahores with the DHAs and the barrier towns, etc. They have they don't they don't have a core of their own, or they have erased the physical um, core of Lahore, um, or have they, or or does that core still remain? Your question is my earlier question when I said, Lahore has a core.
Mm.
Have they really managed to sort of erase that, or does that still hold?
I mean, it's a lovely question. I mean, I'll give you an example. You know, I grew up going to what we call the walled city or Andrun Shahar,
Mhm,
the kind of, let's say, the geographically the oldest parts of the city.
mhm,
And you know, I had some family there. I had friends who lived there. I went and shopped and you know spent time almost every Jummah after every weekend. Um, in about 2018 or 19, when I was researching this book, I was trying to find someone, a shop that sold perfumes, scent, traditional scent making
okay.
shop.
Mhm,
And I came to what I thought was the fork in a very narrow lane, and I was like, "Oh, I think it's on the right side. I think it's on the left side." And there was a young man sitting in the middle of the fork. It's a cobbler who was fixing shoes, and I asked him, "Do you know where this shop is?" And he looked at me and he said, "You know, I have no idea." And I said, "No, I think it's like literally like five blocks or 5 steps away from you. So you have not seen it or heard of it?" And he said, "No." And
mhm,
I realized that the majority of people who lived in the city were no longer people who were born or were intimate with the walled city. In fact, the walled city was full of people who were migrants themselves, mostly from the northwest or Afghanistan, who worked in the warehouses that Lahore Andarun city had been converted into for goods, dry goods mostly. and that the inhabitants of Lahore city now lived in the DHAs
Mm-hmm.
and in the housing colonies far, far away because they wanted space and big houses and places to park cars and go have shopping mall experiences, none of which is possible in the old city. So the oldest geographical core of the city, thus, is emptied out of its meaning, um, precisely because the people who live there are no longer living there. And in the last 20 years, the Androon Shahar has been converted into a type of internal tourism. That is tourism which primarily attracts people in Lahore to Lahore for the visiting the fort or the Wazir Khan Masjid or other sites.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that part is, I think, striking to me is that I don't know of any other city where the tourism industry is actually to inhabitants of one's own city, such as the dislocation in Lahore. And so it forces a type of mm, strangeness. So everything is exoticized. It's no longer lived in. It's no longer part of the city. It's almost like it's a stage in which you can play tourist, or you can imagine some other entity built these mosques or these sites, not people like you who look like you and who are from where you are. Um, and this is the type of thing that I think has really shaped the or dislocated this idea of the core, which I think it did exist for a very long time, but likely does not exist in the same way in contemporary Lahore.
I would have to completely agree with that. Um, the Androon Sheher, now parts of it look like a film set, and
Yeah.
it's like a, I don't know if you've been to the old city of Baku, which also feels like that. It's just been, it's an artificial almost construction meant
Mm,
for tourist shops. And
mm,
in the restoration, so-called restoration of the walled city of Lahore seems to feel that way now. Uh,
mm,
it no longer reminds me of, the Lahore of my teenage years spent in Lahore. My visit to the old city was primarily to Lal Haveli
yeah.
during for me, right? I mean, for some,
Hmm, hmm.
something else, and for boys and men, it was something. Lahore was very different from what it is for what it was for girls. Um, uh, we had limited places we could actually go to and walk to, and in a certain season or a time where it was
Yeah,
possible, and Muharram was one of those times, and
right.
where a girl could walk, and in those lanes, and it doesn't feel that way anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you go to Rome or if you go to Istanbul or any city that has a long-lived history, the sites, the so-called historical sites, are just regular places. People are still living there, walking there, eating there, having lunches and coffees.
Mm-hmm.
And so there isn't this alterity of you are on a set, you are on a managed space that you need to perform a role in that set.
Mm-hmm.
And in a city like in Pakistan city, especially most contemporary period, the kind of gendered segregations, the ways in which certain spaces are restricted to, or not available to people of other faiths or
Mm-hmm.
other sects,
Mm-hmm.
all of that, I think, is against the Lahore of 40 or 50 or 70 or 80 or 100 or 200 years ago. In other words, all of this is so new that it hasn't even fully sunk in that how different Lahore was for a very, very long time, and how inclusive its social fabric was for a very long time.
Do you think Was it really that inclusive, or is that part of our longing for a past and imbuing it with a certain amount of magical thinking?
No, I don't think it's magical thinking at all. I mean, in my book, I try to show precisely how this inclusivity worked. What did it mean for a Hindu Raja over a Muslim minority? What did it mean for a Muslim ruler over a Hindu majority?
Mm,
So, for the most vast life of Lahore,
mm,
the city comprised of non-Muslim majority,
yeah,
and it was a capital. And it was as a capital, it had all kinds of uh, elite who were non-Muslim. And as a non-Muslim elite city, those those social structures were without any friction that one sees in historical records. They were without any conflict that is so attuned that we can point to it and call it a rupture.
mm,
Even when the Sikh empire begins, and I know in Lahore people say a lot of things against the Sikh rule. The 19th century largely is a century in which the Sikh elite, cultural elite, political elite, and Hindu and Muslim elite are indistinguishable from each other in terms of their cultural production, in terms of their sponsorship of civic infrastructure. I mean, even some of Lahore still is um, pays witness to this, right? If you look at the Foreman Christian College or
mm,
Gangaram Hospital or all these other structures, Model Town itself, the very sort of town, the first planned city in a colonized world, planned by a Hindu architect. These things tell you that this isn't romanticism. It's not longing. It's what lived and continued to live. And the in my book, I actually make points to say that the shock of partition wasn't simply the shock that the subcontinent is being partitioned. The shock of partition was that Lahore was in Pakistan. I mean,
yeah.
that was the most shocking thing. And this is the most shocking thing because Lahore was never imagined as one of the places that fell under the sort of, the notion that it's a Muslim majority city and hence must go to Pakistan. The vast majority of Lahore's elite, people who ran the city, businessmen, um, and the substantial number of Lahore's population was non-Muslim. So that again tells you that this idea that it wasn't inclusive is something we have now imagined in our non-inclusive present. That, oh, inclusivity must have been a mirage. It must never have existed because if it had existed at some point, then we would have figured it out now. Why aren't we inclusive? Well, we're not inclusive because of this self-citizen state triad that I was talking about, which creates pockets of people that are othered based on their religion, othered based on their belief, othered based on their sexuality or their gender. And so the one of the reason that I make such a, I don't know, I repeatedly make this point that Lahore is partitioned from its past is precisely because these histories, these actual lived histories, are unimaginable to us. They are so far removed from our present consciousness.
Uh, Again, are they removed from our present consciousness? Because after all, uh, Manan, there are all these universities and colleges and libraries in Lahore. Aren't they the receptacles, the guardians of history and memory?
Um, I guess theoretically, the process of writing history is an active process. It's not a passive process. It doesn't just happen in absentia of an a will to write. What I demonstrate in the book is that after Pakistan's foundation, elites in Lahore, cultural elite, political elite, religious elite, um, begin a very concerted effort to write a new history for Lahore, for Pakistan.
Mhm.
And this effort is going to last, 50, 60 years. And in on case after case on Lahore's Sikh past or Lahore's Hindu past or the place of Ahmadis in Lahore or place of Shia in Lahore, case after case type of whittling of Lahore's history is done. Um, you mentioned archives. Archives are interesting because again, they're not passive repositories. Things don't just live there once deposited. Uh, I go into the process through which archives were constituted in Pakistan. The thing I mentioned before was these archives are in languages that are not taught. So there's a skill that's involved. And then these archives are not cataloged. They're not available. The Secretariat, which houses the Punjab State's archive, the previous Sikh state and the British state, they just began a cataloging project in 2016, which is 70 some years after partition. So the fact that there are libraries, there are only two, but sure, the fact that there are universities, or the fact that people have access to, in principle, books, does not mean that there is a will to imagine the past in any systematic or thoroughgoing way. In fact, there's the opposite, that there is a will to render Lahore's history and Pakistan's history alongside a very narrow, understood, conceived, and imagined grounds.
Mhm.
And so that's what we see rather than a proliferation of histories that allow a citizen or a self in Lahore to imagine and know about its deep past.
Mhm. And in a way, your whole book is structured towards this, isn't it? The forgetting of Lahore, the writing of Lahore, um, you know, making this new nation with this forgetting, um, and forgetting its memory and its origins, and then creating this new kind of a people without that memory. And then but as you walk through Lahore, there it is whispering to you what it is, right?
Yeah, yeah, well put. Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's exactly the right. That's exactly the intention. Yes.
And well, you know, I that's what I felt, and in walking that Lahore, whereas you're saying there are two libraries, where only two libraries, and there's an archival system that's just begun cataloging. Well, then there's that whole other set of documenting, that sits as pulp fiction or
Mm,
pulp nonfiction that you're
mm.
browsing through and finding documents in as you're walking through Anarkali and other places.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's very hard for sometimes it's very hard for people to understand what colonization does to a nation or a people. And we understand colonization as the taking of sovereignty and the taking of resources and the extraction of people, forced removal of people to labor or to indenture far away, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the um, key aspects of colonization is the removal of knowledge itself. And that's everything from the languages of knowledge making and people making, but also raw materials for knowledge making and people making. So in the process of writing this book, almost 80, maybe slightly more than 80% of the archive that I assembled to write this book was assembled from the street, from
Mm-hmm.
chance encounters, from gaddi shops, shops where books are pulped,
Mm-hmm.
people who had some manuscript or some text in their personal library. Almost very little of it was in an actual library or an archive inside Pakistan. I mean, a lot of the research I did was in colonial archives and colonial libraries in London or Paris or Chicago. Mm, But again, it tells you that having these repositories doesn't mean that the post-colonized citizen is able to have access to their history. So this process of walking and talking and seeking was not like going to an archive where you have a finding aid and you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to look at these three documents today and I'm going to copy them. It's it's almost by pure coincidence, pure serendipity, pure chance. In fact, chance is one of the biggest kind of agents in the book. Over the course of 10, 11 years that I took to research and write this book, um, a lot of things that are in this book are just literal happenstance, just pure coincidence that I got my hand on a text or I met someone who told me about something or some way of thinking about Lahore opened up to me because I looked at a door or saw a path that I had never been before.
Just thought right now as you were talking that, this colonization has also been the Raddiization of all
Hmm.
of our uh, what we put value on. So these DHAs and the area towns of today, and people leaving their places, um, because within the inner city of Lahore, because they don't look at it as a wonderful, amazing, um, privilege to live in these old homes or buildings, and they want to go to the new shiny thing. That's not the only reason they're moving. I do know that, I do understand that, but they don't put value on what these places are. Partly because they don't belong to those places, but also because they just don't value those things, right? They're throwing
Yeah.
out details, they're throwing out objects, the kind of things that you can use to interrogate history. What was this particular implement used for? Or what was this container used? What is this vessel for? Those things have been just discarded and thrown away.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think I like this very much, radicalization. I think this pulp, making something pulp in order for it to be transformed into something else or discarded. Yeah, I see this exactly as you're saying in the kind of movement of physical movement of people away from the older parts of Lahore to the new colonies and the treatment they have of Lahore's history. I mean, I have dear family friends in my immediate family, not far away people, but people that are very closely related to me, who are born and raised in Lahore, who I've never, and I cannot emphasize this enough, never heard of or been to any place that I would consider to be like, I don't know, obvious, like Shalimar Garden. So someone who was born in the early 80s in Lahore, but has lived in the peripheries, lived in one of these colonies that surround Lahore, have never been to Shalimar Garden.
Mhm.
Um, and there's class, so class plays a large role in it. Gender plays a large role in it, obviously, as you already mentioned. Where can a person go or not go? But also this idea that this is not of value, anyways.
Yeah,
So one would imagine going to, I don't know, Central Park in New York before one would imagine going to Shalimar Garden in Lahore.
exactly.
And that's, that's a shame. That's a real shame.
That is such a huge shame. Or going to Shalimar Gardens because some Englishman came by and wanted to visit and asked you to
Yeah,
visit them there, and then suddenly it becomes something for you.
yeah,
And then you
yeah,
realize that, oh, you know, that perfume called Shalimar by Guerlain,
yeah. Yeah.
and or that uh, Bibiya Pak Damana, they
Hmm.
discovered it because
Yeah.
now it's become a tourist spot and has been radiyized, by the way. Toba Toba. I shouldn't say it like that, but
Yeah, no, I get it. I get what you're saying. Yeah, I
out,
get what you're saying.
has been turned into pout.
Yeah.
And or Karbala Gamesha, and
Hmm.
look at what they've done to Data Darbar, and
Hmm.
um, a thousand tiny sites all over Lahore that
Yeah.
come from 1,000 years of history. Um,
Yeah.
you're right. You're right. And Mia Mir, talk to me about Mia Mir a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the I grew up very, very close to where Myanmar is
I did.
physically. Um, and so as you know, there's a Goroga Kabristan right next to it. And I used to play, I don't think this is in the book actually. But we used to play cricket very close to there's a Gandanala and there's very close to there was a small cricket ground and we used to play cricket in it. And I remember just sitting on Jumeirats, just sitting, listening to someone recite the Quran or sing, recite, the Heer or just being under a tree and just feeling like this is the most peaceful, most sort of serene place in the world. And then in the process of writing this book, I actually read Dara Shiko's 17th century kind of, remembrances of Myanmar. And suddenly he's like, well, Myanmar sat under the following 27 trees in Lahore and meditated and the whole architecture of Lahore shifts in my head from a city of gardens and monuments to a city of trees. The most significant trees, the most oldest trees, the trees under which people such as luminaries, such as Mia Mir and others, sat and prayed and meditated, and it's such a kind of important part of Lahore for me. And again, when there was the string of suicide bombings that targeted especially shrines of prominent Sufis in Peshawar, in Pakpatan, in Tata Darbar, um, the physical infrastructure of the site changes with large concrete walls, morchas, barbed wire, new signage about what kind of prayers are allowed, whether or not women are allowed inside the ahata or inside the maqbara, the whole kind of if you have never been there and you go to it now, that entire world is out of completely out of view. That world of affect that I'm describing. And so the relationship of Lahore to sites such as Madhulal Hussein's or Dada Darbars or Mia Mir or Miani Kabristan, these are relationships that I feel are centuries in the making, centuries of storytelling, centuries of mothers and fathers telling their sons and daughters about why they are the most important places for us to visit, to pray, to be in company with each other, what kind of festivals they should be there, what kind of foods they should be there. Um, and that entire infrastructure I suspect sometimes, and sometimes I fear, has been radically shifted in the last 20 years or so.
Oh, yes.
Um,
Just
and then so it's, it just changes the meaning of the city to my in my head.
mhm, centuries of a code of conduct.
Yes.
Mhm. In ending your book, you hope that for another flourishing of Lahore. Um, what does that look like to you? Or, in the beginning of our conversation today, you seem to indicate that Lahore is in that flourishing. Or did I hear you wrong?
No. Lahore is unbreathable. You can't breathe in Lahore. And if you can't breathe, you can't live. It's just a tragedy of carbon-based people and beings that we all are. Lahore's soil is full of chemicals and waste. Water is almost gone. You can't see because of pollution, and you can't breathe the air. So the flourishing is not visible to me. In fact, the opposite. So I mentioned that, the UN had this estimate that by 2050, about 300 million people in North India will have to become forcible migrants because of questions of heat and air. And I suspect Lahore is one of the cities alongside places like Multan and Faisalabad that face that future, that immediate future. And obviously Delhi, is one of the cities that is also impacted. So the 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 lesson, I guess, from the hopeful lesson that I got from reading 1,000 years worth of things about Lahore was that there is some political will, social will, cultural will that can resurrect a city like Lahore after a destruction, after a fire, after a flooding, after a demolition by an invading army. Um, and I hope for that political will. I hope for that social will. I hope for that cultural will, that will to survive. But that will to survive has to understand that and here the we are people from, Kabul to Dhaka, that we have to have a collective understanding of what survival looks like. And that the borders that we have aren't going to filter our air or produce our water or allow us to breathe on either side. So if this is a common desolation, then there's a version of nationalism that says, let's all go down to, or I will make you go down before I go down, etc., etc. But there can also be a version of nationalism that says we can all survive together. And I think I'm as a historian, I'm hopeful that that's the version we choose.
that if you don't breathe, I don't either.
Yeah, yeah.
Manan, thank you so much. Uh, Actually, this needs to be a much longer conversation, but I think this is probably the spot where we stop talking. And if you have time, um, we could do another episode later. I would love to do that if you would be available for that.
Listen, Maniza ji, this is a book for Lahoris like you. So I'm always happy to talk to you about this. And yes, I mean this is a type of labor that, unlike my other two books, I feel is is done for the hope of sparking new conversations. So yes, I'm happy to talk whenever you are.
Thank you. And I have to say, I'm so glad you called me a Lahori. I was born in Lahore. But then one doesn't know any longer where one actually belongs. Perhaps we belong everywhere. Those of us who are travelers through this life and earth, and these borders are. We understand that this, you don't see borders on the planet from afar.
Yeah, you
Uh,
don't.
yeah, and when I today, as I was preparing to talk to you, I thought of Faiz Ahmed Faiz's beautiful ghazal that or nazm that moves me to tears, that begins "Mere dil mere musafir."
Yes, yes.
Okay.
हुआ फिर से हुक्म सादिर कि वतन बदर हो हम तुम
Bengali
ते गली गली दुआएं
सदाएं
करें रुख नगर, हाँ सदाएं करें रुख नगर नगर का सुराग कहीं से पाए उस चश्मे. I forget. I used to know the whole thing. I remember. Yeah.
So that is, in fact, I had pulled it up so that I would, be able to at least quote a few verses from it. तो क्या कौन to सुराग कोई पाए आगे
Yes, right. Yeah.
सदाएं करें रुख नगर नगर का कि सुराग कोई पाए किसी यार नाम बर का हर एक अजनबी से पूछें जो पता था अपने घर का. आगे आता है सुरेकुए ना शनाए
अरे कोई ना कभी हमको राज करना हमें. It's all in my head, but I can't
से
remember
रात
it right now.
करना कभी इससे
हाँ,
बात करना कभी
कभी उससे बात करना.
में क्या
Yes.
हूँ कि क्या है शबे गम बुरी बला है.
बुरी बला है. Yes.
हमें ये भी था गनीमत जो कोई शुमार होता.
हमें क्या बुरा था मरना
अगर एक.
अगर एक बार होता.
So I think this applies to probably everyone who lived in Lahore for the past through the 1,000 years that have passed, and it will apply to everyone that will hopefully get to live through it in the next 1,000.
Let's hope so. Thank you.
Thank you so much.